Hi everybody, welcome to The Lamp in the Library. My name is Graham.
I'm Kim.
And today we're going to be discussing Jeff VanderMeer's new book, Dead Astronauts, before it gets too hot and we jump in the body of water behind us. So we're coming to you from beautiful Amherst Island. It's a place where you can find fossils of trilobites on the beach, and there's this dystopian concrete factory across the water. So it's a perfect location to discuss the weirdness of Jeff VanderMeer's Dead Astronauts. So let's get into it. What did we think of this wild and interesting book?
Well, what were your first impressions?
My first impressions, I've read a bit of what Jeff VanderMeer has previously published, like the Southern Reach trilogy and Borne, and this is kind of like an unofficial sequel to that book Borne, in that it's takes place in the same setting. You don't necessarily have to have read that book, but I would strongly advise readers to do so. I think this book really carries forward a lot of the themes that Jeff VanderMeer has explored in his previous work, but he does it in a much more fragmented and experimental way. And this wouldn't be a book that I would recommend people start with if you're looking into Jeff VanderMeer's oeuvre. However, I thought this was a remarkable book. I thought the expanding of the themes that he's tackled in the past, and the experimentation both in terms of form and theme was just, I just loved it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that Dead Astronauts itself is said to be a standalone book, but I really feel like to best approach it would be to first read Borne. I would even suggest starting with Annihilation, because so many of the themes and even use of imagery overlaps, and you see a progression in the work and some of the concepts he's working with. But I thought it was a really interesting read. It's challenging at times, but there's a reason why it's written the way it is. It's not, some books you may come across and they're just sort of weird for the sake of weird, but this definitely isn't a book like that. It's to challenge you to really sit and think about the themes and the questions that he's raising and trying to tackle. So I think maybe we should talk a bit about the themes and the style, because we don't want to really give anything away too much about the plot, even though, to be honest, with this book, it'd be kind of difficult to give spoilers away. It's very fragmented, and there's not really a traditional narrative in this book. It's interesting that you said the word weird, because Jeff VanderMeer is one of the preeminent authors in what's known as the weird fiction or new weird fiction movement, which really uses the tropes of science fiction and fantasy that deals with, B-movie themes about monsters. And monsters are very much a big part of this book. It takes place in an unnamed city that is overseen by an unnamed company that is churning out these biotech monstrous creations that are poisoning and destroying the world. So it's very much a dystopian world, but it is a beautiful dystopia. And I think one of the things that Jeff VanderMeer has always been doing in his fiction is grappling with the concept of climate change and how the world is rapidly changing, and how our civilization, the foundations of our civilization, may well be collapsing. And he uses these kind of B-movie tropes like monsters and mad scientists to evoke this world that is decaying. But it's a beautiful dystopia. I think that some of what he's dealing with is questions of consciousness and how consciousness manifests itself in different life forms, how consciousness can communicate, and also some interesting questions of bodies, embodiment. What is it to be in a body? Because there's some, forms that change bodies and or have difficulty staying in a body. And I thought those were some really interesting questions to think about. I say he more focuses on the idea of consciousness in the mental state, what we think of consciousness. Like, I think in many ways the materialist worldview still holds strong, where you just think of it as your brain. But I know that neuroscience is, at the moment, estimates that, for every one message that our minds send, our bodies are sending like 9 messages to our minds. So what is it to be an embodied human, or an embodied being, actually, more to say, an embodied being? And well, I wouldn't say he's like directly talking about those things. I found that it's there in the way that the characters inhabit the being that they are, and their consciousness within the different bodies that they may find themselves in. So I found that to be a really interesting meditation on some of those questions. And not that it's giving answers or anything, but just it has you think about some of those questions. And I think it, with his other work too, sometimes you reach this point where you're like, "Oi, why even keep trying to fight the company, this nameless company?" But he, in this book, seems to be addressing that question in it, of like, what keeps a resistance going? What do you do things for? And he seems to be suggesting that, in the end, a lot of it is about love and joy, but not in a overly sentimental way.
Yeah, I think that's what makes this work hopeful, and all of his work is hopeful on some level. And yeah, I guess we could say that this book is different from his other books, in that his other books seem to be grounded in kind of like the human world, whereas this book, it focuses so much on biotech and beings that have been enhanced or changed by the company. So every character in the book is in some way more than human, if not totally non-human. And I think one of the themes that he's exploring with this book is that in this decaying and destroyed world, humans are being replaced by non-human life forms. He uses the blue fox, this kind of messianic, godlike creature that's able to travel between dimensions, and rules over these foxes, who it is implied, and in fact it was implied at the end of his last novel, Borne, that they were taking over the world, or as the world transitioned from humanity, which had destroyed the world.
Maybe we could talk a bit about the style. How did you feel about, this is a book that definitely switches narrative styles throughout as you go along in the book. How did you feel about that while reading it?
Yeah, I thought it was an exciting book to read, because he was clearly experimenting so much with form. And really each chapter and each character that he follows in this book, he employs a new stylistic form for each of the stories that are almost like vignettes in this world, with some like small amount of overlapping between the stories. So there is a narrative of sorts that you can follow through, but it's really hard to find. And yeah, I found this kind of bold experimentation, like, I loved it, and it was really exciting to read something that was just trying a lot of new things.
Yeah, I found some parts interesting. For the Blue Fox character, there's almost like a trance-like quality to the writing that is from the point of view of the blue fox a lot. It's very repetitive at times, and one section's almost seems like a mantra or something that he's saying, and then again like these trance-like qualities focusing.
Yeah, there's some chapters that are just the repetition of a few sentences over and over with, you know, some different things added, some different elements added to it, but it's just kind of like hammering home this message. You know, specifically with the fox, you know, it emphasizes the joy that the foxes find in their wild life on the margins of the city. But then another chapter emphasizes the suffering that foxes and indeed all non-human life has endured at the hands of humanity over the centuries. And
it goes very dark.
It does go very dark, and especially with the fox storyline. There's like a revenge fantasy of non-human life taking vengeance on, you know, humanity's destructiveness. Finally, that's part of it, and you know, the I guess part of the theme is that the wildness has no morality to it, but humanity has brought such destruction to non-human life, especially in this even more dystopian fallen world, that you know, humanity itself has destroyed itself, and the non-human life and the biotech that has been created is transitioning and transcending humanity.
There's also an element of playing with time and the notion of different timelines, different holes in space and time, so that sometimes when you're reading it, you're not even quite sure where you are. So this use of almost a confusion of time and looking at love, what are you loving, the consciousness, the being, what is it? It reminded me a little bit of when I read the book The Invention of Morel, just the same feeling of sometimes feeling a little lost, and then there's a repetitive nature to it, which I found there was a repetitive nature to this book as well, not in a negative. The point is to sort of jolt you and think about, okay, what's going on? And I think I had a bit of the same feeling sometimes when I read The Invention of Morel and then this book. Even though, you know, they're very different, there's this question of, again, what is consciousness? What is time? How do we relate to one another through consciousness and time? Like really, really big questions.
Yeah. What did you think of Jeff VanderMeer's employing of fairy tale and mythic elements in this book? For example, there's one part where one of the mad scientist characters in the company, he prepares a meal of all the creations that his son has been creating, and his son has to eat it. I mean, this is very much out of Greek myth, and he employs that kind of mythic elements in a lot of aspects of this story. Why do you think he does that?
That's a good question. I think part of it is just, I mean, it's going back to those questions of creation and what better well to go to than myths of creation from, especially, you know, Greek myths, and not especially Greek myths, just myths of all time. Like, these are questions that humans have been grappling with since, I think, in a lot of ways, consciousness was formed, that they were something other than what was around them. And also, they're just so horrific, and nothing gets more horrific than
that's very true.
Like the eating of your own offspring.
Yes.
It's something you find in the natural world as well.
Yeah.
But within storytelling, you know, it jolts you when you read it. And then I think it grounds you back into the beginnings. And many myths are about beginnings. Yeah.
There's very much a dreamlike and hallucinatory quality to the writing and what happens in this book. I mean, there's a reason they went with this kind of trippy cover art for this book. And I think that ties into the kind of mythic, like, and sometimes you're reading this book and it just feels like this, you know, the strange dream that you wake up and you just can't shake for the rest of the day. That's what the writing was like to me.
Okay, yeah. Yeah.
Because it's very, you know, it's very strange, you know, the character that has a bat for a face and has mice in his throat. I mean, why would the company do that? I mean, the company's motives are just so unknowable, and the things they do are so horrific. But, you know, as I said before, it's really a stand-in for, you know, the horror that we as humans impose on non-human life currently. And how the incomprehensibility of what's happening in this book really echoes how incomprehensible it must be for a non-human life form to be living with humans right now.
Yeah, and in his writing style is very fragmented because you are jumping around, and that fragmentation, the way that humans tend to approach many things in a fragmented way, it is definitely thought and argued by many philosophers and thinkers that it's our tendency towards fragmented thinking that don't allow us to embrace and see the wholeness, and through the fragmented thinking is why we destroy one another and destroy our world around us. And by employing fragmentation within the style, it makes you think of that. I think everything stylistically is to make the reader think about the issues, because I wouldn't say that I got as attached to any characters as I have in some of the other books, especially Borne. You know, like Mord, just, you remember Mord, and while I remember some of the horrific elements of some of the characters in the Blue Fox, like, you know, he stands out, but not in the same way, you know, for me at least.
So final thoughts?
Yeah, I definitely would recommend reading Dead Astronauts, but I would, if you haven't read Jeff VanderMeer, I would approach some of his other work first, just to give yourself a grounding that will allow you to more fully appreciate what's happening in Dead Astronauts, as opposed to just jumping right into Dead Astronauts from the start.
Yeah, I would say this is, you know, this is for fans of Jeff VanderMeer. I wouldn't start with this one, but I thought this was a remarkable book. I thought the expanding of the themes that he's been dealing with in all of his work, and I think he's one of those authors that is really, in a fundamental way, grappling with what's going on right now in terms of, you know, global warming and the destruction that humanity is doing to the world in a really interesting and weird way. So kudos to Jeff VanderMeer. This is another triumph, I think. Really like this book.
Great.
So we're gonna go jump in the water, cool ourselves off, cool our dog off. Thanks for watching The Lamp in the Library, and we'll be back soon with more content.
Keep reading.
Keep reading and keep well.